Elena knelt in the snow. Her wrists were bound. The crowd stood in a circle around her, torches burning against the dark. A full moon hung over the courtyard. "She's cursed," someone shouted. "Kill her before she destroys us all," another voice screamed. Elena didn't look up. She was too tired to be afraid anymore. Or maybe she was too afraid to show it. The executioner stepped forward. He raised his sword. Elena's hand started to shake. She tried to stop it. She always tried to stop it. But her chest was tight, and her breath was coming too fast, and the fear was already spreading through her like fire under her skin. The torches flickered. A few people in the crowd noticed. They stepped back. The wind picked up. Just a little at first. Then it pulled at cloaks and hair, circling around Elena's knees. "It's starting again," someone yelled. The ground trembled. Small stones on the courtyard floor lifted and hovered, shaking in place. "Do it now," the elder shouted at the executioner. "Before she brings the wall down on us." The sword came up higher. Then the crowd went quiet. People were turning. Stepping aside. Making room. Alpha King Brennan walked through the opening they left him, straight toward the center of the courtyard. Straight toward Elena. The executioner hesitated, sword still raised. "My king, she's..." "Don't," Brennan said. The blade came down anyway. Brennan caught it. Bare hand. No hesitation. Blood ran down his fingers where the edge bit in, but his grip didn't move. Nobody spoke. Then he turned and looked down at Elena, and reached out and closed his hand around her arm. The wind stopped. The stones dropped back to the ground. The trembling gold light around her feet went still and calm, like it recognized him. Elena stared up at him, shaking, confused. Nobody had ever touched her without flinching. Nobody had ever made the storm inside her go quiet. Not even her. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'll be replying to as many as I can. But Elena hadn't always been standing on her knees in the snow, waiting for death. To understand how she got there, we have to go back to the beginning. 3 days earlier, Elena was on her knees for a different reason. She was scrubbing frost off the stone floor of the meat house, her hands raw and cracked from the cold water. Nobody had given her gloves. Nobody ever did. The heavy bands on her wrists dug into her skin as she worked. Iron wrapped in leather, tight enough that she felt them with every movement. She'd made them herself, 3 winters ago, after the first time she lost control. They were supposed to help. Some days they did. A pack member walked past and kicked over her bucket on purpose. Dirty water spread across the floor she'd just cleaned. "Watch where you're going," he said, though he was the one who'd done it. Elena didn't answer. She never answered. Answering back had consequences she couldn't afford. She picked the bucket back up. Her hands were shaking, but she told herself it was the cold. It wasn't the cold. Later that day, she was carrying a crate of dried meat across the storage yard when 2 younger pack members started laughing at her. Not near her. At her. Loud enough that she'd hear every word. Look at her flinching. Like a beaten dog. She is a beaten dog. Elena kept walking. Kept her eyes down. Kept telling herself it didn't matter, that words were just words, that she was fine. Her chest got tight anyway. The crate in her arms cracked down the middle. Then it split apart entirely, with snapping outward like something inside it had exploded. Dried meat scattered across the frozen ground. A burst of light and force rippled out from her hands, knocking both of the laughing pack members off their feet. For a second, nobody moved. Then the yard erupted into shouting. She did it again. Get away from her. People scrambled backward, some of them tripping over each other to put distance between themselves and Elena. A mother pulled her child behind her legs. An older man spat on the ground near her feet and made a warning sign with his hand. Elena stood in the middle of the wreckage, breathing hard, her hands still glowing faintly at the fingertips. She pressed them against her chest, trying to make it stop, trying to make herself small enough that maybe they'd forget she existed. Cursed, someone muttered. She's cursed. Always has been. She'd heard that word more times than she could count. It still landed like a blow every time. That evening, 3 of the pack elders stood outside the longhouse, speaking in low voices. Elena wasn't meant to hear them, but she was close enough, sitting in the shadows where she usually sat, trying to be invisible. She's getting worse, one elder said. That crate could have been a person. It has been a person before, another reminded him. The Fen boy. 3 years ago. She needs to be handled. Whatever it takes. Elena pulled her knees up to her chest and said nothing. She already knew what handled meant in Frostfang. It had never meant anything good. The next day, the sky turned wrong. Clouds rolled in fast and black, and by mid-morning a blizzard was tearing through the pack territory with a violence nobody had seen in years. Wind howled between the longhouses. Snow came down sideways, thick enough to blind a person standing 3 feet away. By afternoon, half the winter stores had collapsed under the weight of snow and ice, grain and dried meat buried or ruined. The pack beta, a broad, cold-eyed man named Herek, stood in the wreckage of the storehouse and looked for someone to blame. He didn't have to look far. This isn't natural, he announced to the gathering crowd, snow catching in his beard. The winter spirits don't turn on us without reason. Something has angered them. He turned, and his eyes found Elena at the edge of the commons. Something has been sitting among us for years, letting its curse fester. The crowd's attention shifted to her like a physical weight. Elena felt her pulse spike, felt the old fear rising up her throat. That's not, she started. Don't, Herek said, stepping closer. Don't you dare speak. People closed in around her, faces hard, voices rising. Someone grabbed her arm. Elena tried to pull free, tried to breathe, tried to hold on to the calm she'd spent years practicing. It wasn't enough. The panic broke loose before she could stop it. A pulse of golden light burst from her chest, and the sacred stone pillar at the center of the commons, the one the whole pack prayed at, the one that had stood for 200 years, split down the middle with a crack that echoed off the mountains. Silence fell over the crowd. Then screaming. She struck the sacred stone. She'll bring the mountain down on us next. Herek raised his hand, and his voice carried over the chaos like a verdict already decided. This ends tonight. She is a danger to every soul in this pack, and she will be dealt with as one. Elena didn't have time to argue. Guards seized her from both sides, wrenching her arms behind her back. Someone tore the amulets from around her neck, the same ones her mother had given her, and threw them into the snow. The iron and leather bands on her wrists were next, ripped away and left in the wreckage of the pillar. Without them, she felt raw. Exposed. Like a wound with the bandage torn off. Please, she said, to anyone, to everyone. Please, I didn't mean. Nobody looked at her. Not one person in that crowd met her eyes. Not the woman who used to hum to her as a child. Not the man whose life she'd once saved by pulling him from an icy river. Nobody spoke up. Nobody stepped forward. She understood, in that moment, with a clarity that hurt worse than the cold, that she was completely alone. The guards dragged her through the storm toward the central courtyard, her bare feet numb against packed snow and stone. She didn't fight them. There was nowhere to go. That night, beneath the full moon, Elena was brought to the place where her life was supposed to end. They forced her down onto the frostbitten cobblestones, her knees scraping against the ice. Torches lined the courtyard, hissing against the falling snow. The whole pack had gathered, a wall of faces lit orange and cold, waiting. The executioner stepped forward, an iron broadsword resting against his shoulder. Elena knelt there, shaking, too exhausted to be afraid anymore. Or maybe too afraid to let herself feel it. The elder gave the signal. The executioner raised the sword high over his head. And then, for the second time that night, the world went still. The crowd was turning. Parting. A path opened straight through the middle of them, and people stepped back like they'd forgotten how to breathe. Alpha King Brennan walked through the gap, his dark cloak dragging through the snow, his eyes locked on the faint gold light still flickering weakly around Elena's trembling hands. "My king," the executioner said, sword faltering. "She's a danger. She struck the sacred stone." "She." "Don't," Brennan said. The sword came down anyway. He caught it. His bare hand closed around the blade, blood welling instantly where the edge bit into his palm. He didn't flinch. He didn't let go. With one sharp twist of his wrist, the iron cracked and broke in half like it was nothing more than a dry branch. Nobody in the courtyard made a sound. "This woman answers to the crown," Brennan said, his voice carrying across the silence without needing to be raised. "Not to a mob with torches. Whatever judgment is owed her, it will not be decided here, and it will not be decided by you." He turned from the stunned elders and looked down at Elena. She stared back up at him, shaking, blood from his hand dripping onto the snow between them. She didn't understand any of this. Why he'd come. Why he cared. Why a king would put his own hand between her and a blade. He reached down and closed his fingers gently around her arm, lifting her to her feet. The moment his skin touched hers, the wild flicker of gold light steadied. It didn't vanish, it settled, smoothing out into a soft, warm glow, like something in her had finally been allowed to exhale. Elena felt her knees nearly buckle, not from fear this time, but from the sheer unfamiliarity of it. Nobody had ever touched her without flinching away. Nobody had ever made the storm inside her go quiet just by being near. The next morning, Elena woke up somewhere warm. For a moment she didn't move, certain it was a dream, certain she'd open her eyes and find herself back on the frozen cobblestones. But the bed beneath her was soft, the room around her lit with pale morning light, furs draped over her shoulders instead of chains around her wrists. An attendant knocked softly and entered with a tray of hot food, setting it down without a hint of fear in her expression. Elena stared at her like she expected a trick. "You're safe here," the attendant said simply, and left her to eat. Brennan visited that afternoon, though he didn't come with guards or questions barked like orders. He sat across from her, studying the faint golden residue still clinging faintly to her skin, and asked, quietly, how long she'd been living like that. Hiding. Anchoring herself. Waiting to be punished for something she'd never chosen. Elena didn't have an answer that didn't hurt to say out loud. Later, while a fortress healer checked the raw marks left by the iron bands, the woman hissed and pulled her hand back. She'd caught the edge of a hot brazier without meaning to. Elena reached out on instinct, some old, buried need to fix what she'd nearly caused. A soft gold light spread from her fingers into the healer's burned skin. The redness faded. The pain eased. In seconds, the wound was gone entirely. The healer stared at her own hand in disbelief. Brennan went very still, watching. "That's not the same power that broke the pillar," he said quietly. Before Elena could respond, something shifted in the shadows of the rafters above them. An assassin dropped down without a sound, blade already swinging toward her throat. Brennan moved faster than she could track, sword drawn, steel meeting steel a breath from her skin. The assassin was subdued within moments, but when the guards searched him, they found a crest stitched into the lining of his cloak, the same crest worn by the Frostfang elders. Brennan's expression hardened into something cold and unreadable. 2 days later, a royal archivist arrived at the fortress carrying a stack of records older than anyone living. Brennan had summoned him personally, unwilling to let the assassin's crest go unanswered. The archivist spread the documents across a long table, faded names, broken bloodlines, a mystic lineage the realm had believed extinguished decades ago. Elena's mother's name was among them. She wasn't just a woman who died in a storm, the archivist said gently. She was a mystic of considerable power. The amulets she gave you weren't rustic charms. They were seals. She built them to keep your strength hidden, buried deep enough that no one, not even you, would know what you carried. Elena felt something crack open in her chest, something that had nothing to do with magic. She wasn't protecting the pack from me, she said quietly. She was protecting me from people who would have hunted me for this. Yes, the archivist said. Elena looked down at her own hands, the ones she'd spent her whole life ashamed of, the ones that had just healed instead of hurt. Brennan knelt in front of her, meeting her eyes without a trace of fear or pity. Your power isn't a curse, he said. It was starved. Locked away by trauma you didn't ask for. I'm going to help you find the rest of it, however long that takes. For the first time in her life, Elena believed someone meant it. Subscribe if you want to see how deep this bloodline truly goes, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love knowing how far our story is traveling. 3 days later, Elena stood in the fortress courtyard at dawn, her breath fogging in the cold air, watching her own hands like they belonged to someone else. Again, Brennan said. He stood a few feet away, arms loose at his sides, patient in a way nobody had ever been patient with her before. Elena closed her eyes and thought about the crate she'd shattered, the pillar she'd cracked. Every moment her fear had turned into something that hurt someone. Then she thought about his hand closing around her arm in the snow. How the storm had gone quiet. She opened her eyes and let the feeling rise instead of fighting it. Gold light curled up from her palms, not in a burst this time, but in a slow, steady ribbon that wound around her fingers like smoke. It didn't crack the stone beneath her feet. It didn't send anyone stumbling backward. That's it, Brennan said quietly. You're not holding it back anymore. You're just holding it. Over the following days, the training continued, and something in Elena began to loosen that had been tight her entire life. She learned that fear didn't have to become destruction. That grief could move through her hands like water instead of fire. Attendants who once would have flinched from her now watched her practice with open curiosity instead of dread. But the fortress wasn't only a place of healing. Messengers arrived with grim faces and worse news. Regional alphas, whipped into a frenzy by rumors spreading out of Frostfang, were gathering along the mountain passes. The story they told was simple and ugly, that their king had been bewitched by a cursed Omega, that she'd twisted his judgment, that the realm itself was in danger as long as she remained under his protection. Elena heard the reports secondhand, through the tight expressions of Brennan's guards, and something cold settled in her stomach. They're going to come for the fortress because of me, she said that evening, staring out at the dark tree line beyond the walls. They're going to come because they're afraid of something they don't understand, Brennan said, standing beside her. That's not the same thing as your fault. You could give me up. End this before it starts. She didn't look at him when she said it. Your crown doesn't have to be part of this. Brennan turned her gently by the shoulders until she had no choice but to face him. He took her face in both hands, his palms rough and warm against her jaw. My crown means nothing to me if I use it to hand an innocent woman to people who want her dead, he said. I didn't step into that courtyard to protect a political position. I stepped in for you. That hasn't changed, and it isn't going to. Elena searched his eyes for any trace of doubt and found none. Something settled inside her that night, quiet and certain. She was done being someone who hid, who waited to be dragged out into the cold and blamed for existing. If war was coming to this fortress because of what she was, then she would stand and fight for it instead of running from it. 2 days later, the situation collapsed entirely. Word came at first light that the Allied packs had moved past posturing and surrounded the mountain passes in full force, cutting off supply routes and any hope of retreat. Brennan spent the morning locked in the war room with his commanders, voice low and sharp, mapping defenses against an army that outnumbered his garrison badly. Elena brought him water that afternoon, a small gesture, something to do with her hands while the walls around her felt like they were closing in. She was halfway across the room when something made her stop. The goblet in Brennan's hand smelled wrong. Not strongly. Not enough for an ordinary nose. But her senses had sharpened these past days, tuned finer with every session of training, and something bitter sat underneath the water's clean scent. "Don't drink that," she said sharply. Brennan paused, goblet halfway to his mouth. Elena crossed the room in 3 steps and struck it from his hand with a precise snap of golden force, sending the liquid splashing across the stone floor, where it hissed faintly against the tile. The chief advisor standing nearby went very still. "You," Brennan said, low and dangerous, turning toward the man who'd served at his side for years. The traitor didn't bother denying it once the guards seized him. He'd been working for the Shadow Syndicate for months, feeding them Brennan's movements, and the poison had been meant to remove the king from the board before the army arrived. There was no time to process the betrayal properly. A horn sounded from the outer wall before the guards had even dragged the advisor from the room. The outer gate had been breached. By nightfall, there was no longer any question of whether war would come to the fortress. It had already arrived. The blood moon rose slow and heavy over the peaks, staining the snow and stone a deep, restless red. War drums echoed up through the canyons, closer with every passing minute. Brennan strapped on his battle helm, his expression carved from stone. Elena stood beside him in fitted leather armor an attendant had brought her, her hands already glowing with steady, concentrated light. "Stay close to me if you can," Brennan said. "But if you can't?" "I'll be fine," Elena said, and for the first time in her life, she believed it. The gates gave way minutes later. Syndicate mercenaries and hostile pack warriors poured into the courtyard under crimson light, and the fortress dissolved into chaos. Steel rang against steel. Shouts and screams tangled together in the freezing air. Brennan's royal guards held the line as long as they could, but the numbers pressing in were staggering. Elena moved through the fighting without hesitation, her golden light flaring bright around her hands. She threw herself between a wounded guard and a descending blade, catching the strike on a shield of light that shattered the weapon instead of the man beneath it. She disarmed attacker after attacker with sharp, controlled bursts, knocking swords from hands, driving mercenaries back without taking a single life. For a while, it worked. For a while, she felt powerful instead of afraid. But the fighting didn't stop, and neither did the demand on her strength. Every shield she raised, every burst of force she sent out, drained something in her that didn't refill fast enough. Her hands began to shake. The golden light around her fingers flickered, losing its careful shape, threatening to spiral back into the chaos she'd spent days learning to tame. Across the courtyard, a tall figure in dark ceremonial armor watched her falter. The syndicate leader smiled beneath his crimson-lit hood and raised a twisted black artifact, its surface crawling with shadow. He aimed it straight at her chest and released it. The dark energy slammed into her like a physical blow, tangling with the golden storm already spiraling out of her control. Elena's knees buckled. She hit the frozen ground hard, gasping, her own power writhing violently around her, no longer golden and steady but wild and dangerous, exactly like it had been the night they dragged her to the courtyard to die. "There it is," the syndicate leader called out, striding closer through the chaos. "The truth beneath the crown's little pet. A monster that will destroy everyone who loves it." Elena clutched at her own chest, tears streaming down her face, the storm building faster than she could hold it back. Warriors nearby scattered, afraid of what was coming. Brennan heard her name torn from someone's throat and turned in time to see her on her knees, gold light tearing violently around her. He didn't think. He moved. Cutting through enemy ranks with brutal efficiency, ignoring the blade that opened a gash along his ribs, ignoring the mercenary who nearly took his arm off, he fought his way across the courtyard toward the swirling vortex of light and wind that had once been calm and was now consuming everything near it. He didn't stop at the edge of the storm. He walked straight into it. The wind tore at his cloak, debris slashing past his face, but he didn't reach for his sword and he didn't try to hold her down. He dropped to his knees in the dirt beside her, wrapped both arms around her shaking body, and pulled her against his chest, resting his forehead against hers. "Let the storm break, Elena," he said, voice steady even as the wind screamed around them. "I am right here with you." Something inside her that had been braced for impact her entire life finally let go. The bond between them locked into place like a key turning in a lock built specifically for it. The chaotic wind stopped tearing. The scattered golden light stopped fracturing. It gathered instead, drawing inward, forming into a single blinding, radiant sphere of light with the two of them at its center. Elena's eyes opened. They blazed pure celestial gold, calm and endless, her full power finally awake and entirely her own. She rose to her feet with Brennan still beside her, and the light around her didn't waver anymore. It didn't need to be controlled through force or fear. It simply was, steady as a heartbeat. Elena raised her hands, and the golden light rippled outward across the battlefield in a single magnificent wave. The Syndicate leader's dark artifact shattered in his grip, the shadow inside it screaming as it dissolved into nothing. Weapons flew from the hands of hostile warriors across the courtyard, one after another, disarmed without a single life taken. The opposing pack stood frozen, staring at the light washing over them, weapons gone, hostility draining out of their faces and leaving something closer to awe. Within minutes, it was over. Frostfang's elders and the Syndicate's remaining commanders were rounded up by Brennan's guards, stripped of weapons and dragged before the courtyard dais where, only nights before, Elena had knelt waiting to die. Later that morning, with the blood moon fading into pale daylight, the captured leaders were brought forward in chains. Brennan stood at Elena's side, offering her the judgment as her right. The old Elena might have wanted vengeance. The elders who'd hunted her, the beta who'd blamed her, the Syndicate that had tried to weaponize her, all of them kneeling now, awaiting her word. "I won't give you what you gave me," she said instead, her voice carrying clear across the courtyard. "You wanted fear and blood. I choose something better." She sentenced them not to execution, but to trial under new law that, over the following weeks, she and Brennan wrote together, article by article, until every pack in the realm was bound by a royal covenant protecting Omegas and unbonded mystics from the abuse she'd survived her whole life. Months later, beneath a clear morning sky, Brennan placed a crown of silver and gold upon Elena's head before the entire assembled kingdom. The girl who had once knelt in the snow, hated for a power she couldn't control, stood now beside her king as his true queen, looking out over a kingdom finally at peace. Subscribe if you made it through the storm with her, and comment where you're watching from. I want to know how far this story traveled to reach you.